Good evening. The 37th President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon, is in China, the first American chief executive ever to visit the world's most populous country.
On February 18, 1972, Richard Nixon began still another remarkable comeback with a stunning foreign policy success.
President Nixon's motorcade is now sweeping toward the city of Peking.
Here comes the motorcade now, as you see.
The world watched as Richard Nixon drove through a city that few outsiders had seen for nearly a quarter of a century. He knew, said the New York Times, that for this journey, no matter what else occurred, he would always be remembered. That afternoon, Nixon was abruptly summoned to see Mao Zedong. American television was unaware of the meeting. The only coverage was by Chinese cameramen with black and white film. This encounter between Nixon, the career anti-communist, and Chairman Mao, the leader of the largest communist revolutionary movement in history, shocked Nixon's old conservative allies. They accused him of surrendering to international communism. But for Nixon, it was all part of his global strategy. By visiting China, he was beginning to exploit the divisions in the communist world.
One of Nixon's primary objectives in opening up with China was to give him more leverage with the Soviet Union. These relations were essentially stalled, but soon after the opening with China, the Soviet Union became much more flexible in several fronts. They agreed to a summit meeting with us in 1972, and they began to be more reasonable on various arms control issues.
Nixon enjoyed the power game, probably as much as any president in modern times. He played it very hard and very cleverly and very carefully in the world scene. And he was always thinking strategically, and that's one of the qualities that someone has to have in foreign policy. I mean, you cannot make decisions in foreign policy based on today's circumstance. You've got to think about its ramifications for 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. It's like a chess player. You're anticipating 6 moves ahead if you're a good chess player.
We love you, President. Oh, yes, we do. We love you, President, and we'll be through. When you're not near us, we're blue. Oh, President, we love you.
In the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese suddenly launched a massive offensive. South Vietnam's forces were overwhelmed. Thousands fled. If the offensive were not stopped, the war would be lost, and with it, Nixon feared the presidency. But if he ordered a U.S. counterattack, the Soviets might cancel the upcoming arms control summit in Moscow, a vital part of Nixon's grand design. Most of his advisors urged Nixon not to take any action that might jeopardize the summit. Once again, Nixon overruled them.
His view was that it would be embarrassing for him to go to Moscow without responding to North Vietnamese aggression, that he would look weak. He's talking to Soviet leaders who are providing arms to the North Vietnamese troops who are killing American troops. So he didn't think the summit was worth it unless he could also show that he was strong within Vietnam itself.
Nixon ordered the most drastic escalation of the war since 1968. Massive, sustained bombing of Hanoi and the mining of Haiphong Harbor, risking a full-scale confrontation with the Soviets by putting their supply ships in peril. After explaining his decision to the American people, he made a direct appeal to the Kremlin.
Our two nations have made significant progress